Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I want to take a deep dive and really discuss the topic about parsing and FFLOGS, because you know what, this is probably one of the most significant, kind of controversial topics in the community. And for the record, if anyone's wondering what my opinion is on it off the bat, well, I use it. It's a tool that is incredibly helpful to me, to say the least, and I actually don't think that I would be anywhere close to as good of a player as I am without it. I do actually consider it really mandatory. Now, I know that some of you are probably really upset to hear that, which I'm not trying to be, and hopefully, as I just discussed through everything, that I'm going to be able to explore my thoughts and why I came to that conclusion for myself, but also show why some people would even be really upset about that. Like, why would that make someone upset? What negatives are there? And so this video is really me going to be diving into the deep depths of discussing all the different topics and viewpoints of it, and trying to be as unbiased and fair as possible. And so topics that we're going to cover include growth and learning, newer players burgeoning into trial and raid content, weaponization of information. I know some of you are going to bring that up in the comments section before I even get to this point of the video. Guilt, cringe, specifically looking at contemptuous cringe and compassionate cringe. Next up, jobs and roles and what kind of impact parsing and FFLOGS has on someone even picking a job or a role, or getting into a group as a particular job and role. And then finally, I want to close this up with going into group goals versus individual goals. So let's discuss FFLOGS and parsing in Final Fantasy XIV. So our first topic is going to be on growth and learning. Final Fantasy XIV has undeniably had an influx of new players, and so I feel that at this point it's really relevant to a lot of players recently to be talking about this first and foremost. So for me as a player, I am the type of person who always wants to improve and to know exactly where I personally do stand. And so when I am new to a game, not really sure what is going on, and then I like to really get my footing when I'm in a new game. It's just like, how am I doing? Am I doing really well? Am I maybe doing a little bit worse than I probably would have, could have, should have? And I like having this information. Like, am I doing this rotation correctly? Am I contributing to my team's success in the best way I possibly can? Am I seeing a steady upward trend in my ability to contribute? For me, I like to get that upward trend. I like that growth. As long as I'm growing, I'm happy. So let's take, for instance, my Summoner Guide video, to which I owe a great deal of my success on this platform towards. Immensely so. Undeniably, I think that was actually my breakout video that really pushed things forward. How to say it? I would never in a million years have been able to make that guide if I didn't get that feedback that I get from parsing. Especially on that monster of a rotation. That Summoner rotation is a beast. But also, I do know that I'm not alone in that situation where we wouldn't have gone to the level that we would have if we didn't previously have it, or a tool to give us that constant feedback as we're going through a rotation, as we're trying it out in different trials, in different dungeons, in different savages. I know that I'm not alone in that feeling. So let's take it, though, from a different perspective. Is that when you get influx of new players, it really helps you to assess, how are they going to do? Are they going to be able to make the cut? And then it helps them, if they're more of a growing type of raid leader, identify key areas of weakness that you know what they can improve upon. And likewise, with the spirit of growth, with always getting better and always setting yourself up to be better. Sure, you might not be great today. You know what? I sure as heck wasn't when I started. Oh my god, 1.0 days. Can I repress that memory yet from 1.0? But honestly speaking, it's just, I might not be great today, but you know what? In a week from now, I'll be better. In a week after that, I'm going to be even better. And you know what? In 4 months, I'm going to clear that ultimate fight. And you know what? That is honestly, I think one of the things that a lot of people overlook when they're looking at tools like FFLOGS or parsing in general is they don't realize that this is actually a tool that, like, say you have this raid leader who recruits you and they're just like, hey, could you try this with this different rotation? I'm noticing that this is a little bit harder for you. Here's how you handle this mechanic. It can be used as a stepping stone to just get you always improving, always better and better next time. And I mean, let's take a brief pause and let's be open here. Let's be super honest. Most people don't come to a game, any game, with intention or desire to be bad at it. We're literally coming to play this game from our own volition and while also paying a monthly subscription. People are literally paying to be here. So, like, when I start a new game, I don't go in there being like, hey, I want to be really bad. I'm planning to ruin your day. You know what? I'm going to queue just for this extreme trial, and I'm intentionally going to screw up your day. Haha. I mean, maybe some people are like that, but I think for the most part, most people aren't like that. But especially when someone is joining a new game, you really need to curb your expectations. Because, of course, if I'm new, I might suck. In fact, I really suck in some instances, but for some people, just giving them the tools and giving them the time to adjust, which FFLOGS and parsing is a tool, I genuinely believe that most people would make a real attempt to improve. But now let's talk about the cons on this point. There is, however, no denying that people can take FFLOGS parses and weaponize them against other players. Over the years of playing this game, I have absolutely noticed that a lot of players will react and respond to other players' parses and will use that parse to degrade them or rub off their achievement. Just being like, oh, why did it take you this many parses to clear Shiva? Oh, you only parsed gray. Did you really clear Shiva with the gray parse? And when people go at that, it's very belittling and very kind of humiliating. It strips away that achievement, that accomplishment that that person should be proud of. In fact, I just saw that just a few days ago, even on a particular forum, and it was like, no, don't talk like that. Don't let this person say that, no. But it should be said that it does get to people. It definitely does. I mean, I have literally had people who have cleared that fight and others come to me and just be like, so-and-so said that this clear didn't count, even though I did clear it, and like, just because I parsed green, that I'm really not good or whatever. And it's kind of heartbreaking, because when I'm there for this person, it's just like, you still literally cleared it. But what I've noticed is, like, even if I do try and talk to someone about this, that just like that negativity, just that onslaught of negativity just takes such a higher priority. Even though I'm like, hey, you literally have factually cleared it, they're like, oh, no, but I parsed gray, I'm the worst player, I should maybe quit raiding altogether. And I'm like, whoa. But that's the kind of thing that when people weaponize parses really can undermine that achievement, and it's really depressingly sad. It's like, no, you cleared it still. But I should ramp that up. Yeah, I had that one recent thing, but you know what? For the most part, I really think I should say that I haven't seen too much of this for a while. It might have peaked maybe a year or two ago when I saw it quite a bit more, but lately I've noticed that people are a lot less, at least outwardly, toxic towards other players, and I actually do think that's a good thing. It's just like, because in the greater context of everything that's going on, that we currently have a lot of things going on across the entire world. Lots of people are, even for the very first time, trying out an MMORPG in general, or gaming in general. And a lot of people honestly are not doing as well as you might have hoped for in your leveling dungeons, or in your experts. But the thing is, when someone is new to something, one of the most demoralizing and soul-crushing things to experience is to be ripped apart for it. Because you thought that their damage numbers were bad, you went after them, and that's one of the saddest things to hear for me. Like, I have genuinely had friends and literally even family quit over such things. It's not really an awesome feeling. As I said before, most people probably don't want to intentionally be bad, so it really does suck when they're informed you're bad. And even if it is objectively, even removing all emotion, even if it is objectively true, Criticism, constructive or not, is a very, very hard pill to swallow. It takes a lot of learning to learn how to be able to take criticism. Learning that even I had to do. Heck, even I am still afraid to publish some YouTube videos because I am admittedly a bit terrified of the potential criticism I might get. Case in point, this video in particular even. In before the comment section is filled with the comment cringe, because especially after lexically priming everyone to the word cringe in the opener, yeah, cringe. But for a new player who is earnestly trying their best, being told that they suck or ripped down is a pretty negative feeling. And if we're being super honest, the internet is not known as the kindest critic to people. And even I myself have had, seen someone tear into Sprout right in front of me in Final Fantasy XIV. And that's a brand new player if you aren't familiar with the term Sprout. In Final Fantasy XIV, our newer players have a little Sprout icon. And this one was just torn into. And of course, though, I want to say, I defended, and ultimately that aggressive person was kicked. But, before people say that, oh, they were just giving constructive criticism, believe me, what I have read was the furthest thing from constructive criticism. Honestly. But, heck, I think that probably the best examples of struggles would be, healers and tanks. Honestly, they often get it especially bad in leveling content because them making mistakes is literally a public spectacle. If the tank wipes, the party's probably going to wipe if the healer isn't healing. Similar kind of scenario, but I do digress. Now that gets into the notion of guilt. And with parsing and logs, guilt is a heavy burden for some people to bear. And if you want my honest opinion, guilt shouldn't even be a thing in video games. At all. Of course, there are situations where you maybe would've, could've, should've done better, but let's not forget that we're all here because we want to be on our free time, and that we are also actively paying to be here. I think that that's one thing that I have said in the past that has made people really go, oh, is yeah, you're literally paying to be here. But I can speak for myself, at least, when I say that guilt has weighed heavily on my mind sometimes when I've been playing this game, or heck, gaming in general. So let's take, for instance, in Final Fantasy XIV, Cinderdrift Extreme, one of the fights that I did near the end. And so, based on past videos, I have clearly farmed the heck out of it. I got my mount, I knew what I was doing at this time, and it was one of the later rounds before I got this mount, though, and I accidentally wiped us near the end on comments. Of course I felt bad. Of course I did, because we were so nauseatingly close to clearing it. If you know the comments phase, that's pretty close to the end, and everything was going perfectly, and everyone was going to get another tome and another chance to mount, and I messed it up. It was heartbreaking, honestly. The group actually, I think, disbanded after that. I can't remember for sure, because I know that if you wipe at the second phase, that you start again at the second phase. Thank goodness for that. For the record, I like it when I don't need to go right back to the start. Thank you, Hades, for ruining that experience for me. But I think that we might have actually had people rage quit in this instance. For real. So, ultimately, that was on my head for how we failed that fight, and I'm actually the one to blame. I knew the mechanic for the comments, I knew where to stand, where to not stand, and I knew the best case scenario would have not been how I did it. And so, in spite of all that, I still blew it. But we're talking about parsing here, and so my mechanics example doesn't exactly fit perfectly, but the same principle and the same idea of making a mistake like a mechanic or your rotation applies guilt to yourself in full. Let's say I'm on my bard and we're at 0.1% from clearing. Ugh, so close, right? I think that a lot of people who've done Savage Raiding have been at this point where it's you wipe at that 0.1 or whatever percent, and it's gosh, we're so close. And that's super demoralizing. But let's say that I'm on my bard, just continuing that example, and then I realize that I didn't swap my song to the next song once my last song ran out. So let's say I was on Mage's Ballad and then I forgot to hit Army's Pieton or whatever, and that I basically just denied my group the DPS buff for say 60 seconds, so a full minute. And bringing up bards on FFLOGS, you can check and see that those songs really do make up decent DPS contribution for sure. Off the top of my head, I think it's 200 or so. And meaning that because I forgot a song, well, that 0.1% would have been made up for it most likely. And here, in this example, we are ignoring that bards have a whole lot of mechanics on those songs, but just roll with but the point is that this feeling is one that was shared by many players, or is shared by many players, and it sucks. In fact, many people just can't cope with that feeling at all and just say, nah fam, I'm done, and quit raiding completely. Talking to a few people super into housing or crafting or something like Ishgard Restoration, which I guess is crafting, mind you, but let's say gathering. And it's pretty clear that some of them, that the reason that they just do housing or just do crafting, but never touched a savage raid in ages, is because they had such a bad experience, and they just couldn't handle going back to that again. Even if I look back at some of my own performance with my group sometimes, my current group, my numbers sometimes suck, if I'm being honest. I'll be open enough with that. Sometimes my numbers really suck. And then during those times, I feel like I'm letting everyone down. So when someone brings up such numbers again and again and again, that crushes my morale. I instead of think, oh, I want to queue up again and try again. Maybe we can get higher next time. Me being the insecure, anxiety-ridden mess that I am, instead think, oh my gosh, I don't want to deny my friends the ability to clear, so you know what, I'm just gonna sit out and let them take someone else other than me. And that has literally crossed my mind. I mean, even in the past month, probably like 3 or 4 times. Like, I default to that. I know a lot of other people do, but like, that's just me being super honest and super open. But me being me, that is genuinely something I feel all the time. That those numbers are tied to guilt and shame when they're done poorly. But knowing my numbers and wanting to improve in a sense could be a way of coping with that. That ever onwards growth and using these failures and points of pain as a way to struggle and climb myself up to the top, to the point where, yeah, you know what, I do want to make an ultimate guide on job X or Y or Z, and likewise I have. But not everyone can or wants to even bounce back like that. Like, you need to be able to want to bounce back like that. That's probably the biggest thing, is you really want to have that drive. But instead, for a lot of people, they just rather forego that altogether, and there is nothing wrong with that unless they actually genuinely want to do the content, but just can't get past that massive guilt. But here I am talking a lot about guilt and failure, but that is honestly really a lopsided view on parsing, and I do feel that that is disingenuous angle if I continue to push it. Parsing gives me the confidence that I did the best that I could, and that I did contribute, and that I shouldn't be overly harsh on myself in a lot of fights. And that is the flip side of the tool. It lets you know how you're doing, and that if you wipe, to not necessarily blame yourself. If your numbers are good, and if you dealt with the mechanics that you had to properly, how is that your fault? And for me, this relieves me of the guilt that might otherwise have dissuaded me from continuing to try that content, to have statistical and mathematical evidence that I did fine and I tried my best and it wasn't my fault. Not that I like to shift the blame onto others, but just for me myself to know that, hey, you know what? This isn't my fault. I need to move on from the situation and I need to continue. And I mean, that might sound like a cop-out, but that's the truth for me. There are many times that if I didn't know and if I didn't have proof, that I might have actually just given up. Alas, the burgeoning young raider, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. On to our next point, burgeoning into the raid scene. Burgeoning. I had to say that. Burgeoning. Nice FFLOGS you've got there. It would be a shame if something were to happen to it. Oftentimes, I've gotten a comment or a message in game about someone who really wants to get involved with the raid scene. Like, they really want to. Whether it be extreme trials or in savage content, but they just really feel insecure or unconfident in their ability to do it. And I think that this is a good segue from guilt, actually, in the last section, because probably the #1 reason I've heard people don't try raiding is because they are genuinely scared of messing up, and they don't want to ruin other people's experiences on top of just their own. Like, what if I join a Cinder Drift Extreme and then I wipe? Or what if I only parse the so-called fabled gray? What will happen to my history or my record on FFLOGS? That will haunt me forever. I will never be able to get into another group ever again in my life. My FF14 career will be over. And while I say it like that, people genuinely do believe this in many instances. Which, for the record, I do need to say, in 95% of pug parties, through like Party Finder or whatever, that doesn't even seem to happen. That record doesn't follow you around. But I can say though, that if I'm being super honest, there is like a 5% of Party Finder groups that will come back and be like, nah, we checked your FF logs and you aren't great at this, bye. But those people suck and they are lame, so let's be honest, you're probably better off without that in your life. But to someone new to the like raiding scene, it can be really intimidating. Like being like, wow, I'm literally going to have every single action, every single move I make be shown. And that this is going to be on this like big website that so many people go on to, and it's going to follow me forever. And that's daunting to some people, and that's fair. But the reality is for probably like 98% of the content in the game, with the last 2% being like ultimate raids and like the last two tiers of savage raids, you probably shouldn't even be that worried about being put on blast at all. Like, I have seen some of that, but nowhere near that much. But reality is that most players in this game in general don't parse. You can't even parse on a console, and let us not forget that PS4 players are playing on the exact same servers we are. So they don't even have the option to parse it, even if they wanted to. Like, at all. At all, at all, at all. And so that's just being super honest. And reality is, from like 98% of the content, you really don't even need to. In fact, I'd say of all the extreme trials, like let's think about like raiders getting into there. For all of the extreme trials that we have, I'd say that Cinderdrift Extreme, the most recent trial, is that I did notice that this might be the best quote-unquote gateway extreme to get players into extreme content. Especially if you don't like, how do you say it? It's just like the mechanics are pretty clear. The DPS check is honestly super low. I have cleared that fight when we had so many deaths in the party that we had no business clearing it. And I think it's great, especially because it's like if you wipe on phase 2, you start at phase 2. I think that this is like the best extreme for players looking to get into extremes. Not even to mention older extremes, once you have a higher item level just naturally through playing through a later patch, they become a lot easier to tackle. And so going back to some of those older fights, I think is a really good way to build up confidence and just get exposure to a lot of these mechanics, because a lot of these mechanics do translate into other fights. Like if we look at some mechanics, we're just like, oh yeah, I saw that with Twintania, or oh yeah, wow, I saw that back with Alexander Savage, or something like that. And so there is definitely a lot of skill transfer involved in this. Contrast this, however, with a fight like Gruden Ifrit Savage, which has a very steep DPS check, if I'm being super honest. Just hearing like all the talk, seeing the forum posts, talking to people, the party finder groups and all that, it has a very steep DPS check. And some of the hardest mechanics in the game to even see, especially if you don't turn off particle effects, which made a huge difference even for me. Like those nails that came out of the ground, oh my god, they were hard to see. Like those nails were brr. But we're more talking about parsing here, so I'm gonna reel it back. We're not talking about players necessarily getting started with that. But I think that a lot of the fear of newer players is like the mentality and the anxiety about what am I going to go with and what's going to happen, and what's the mentality of myself. Like, is that tool going to help or hinder me? My opinion is definitely it's going to help, but to some people they might not want to know that. And then it also depends on the mentality that you're like, of like who you're grouped with, and that's going to be a point of topic in a little bit. But what if you are going to use it as a tool for growth? Personally, I find that extremely healthy and a great way to look at it. It's just going to be something that you always use to improve. Like I said before, of like that topic of growth and always getting better and better. I love that. But if you're with a raid leader who's just using it to bring down the hammer and just lash you and like tear you down, I mean, number one, find a new raid group, because that's just not a good thing to be in. Just find a new group. And I have honestly been in a raid group like that, and honestly they made me feel super demoralized. I wasn't inspired to raid, and I didn't even talk when I showed up, honestly. And ultimately the group broke up on the third fight of the last tier of Savage and Stormblood. It was that little larboard robot. But yeah, that's Stormblood. Yeah, Stormblood. I don't want to talk much more on that expansion at all. But changing the topic, let me speak for myself on this point. Parsing and tools like FFLOGS greatly enhanced my confidence in my ability to be able to tackle harder and harder fights, and content I probably wouldn't have even bothered trying if I didn't have it. Honestly, when I quit, because like just lots of stuff happened, I think that the one fight that really brought me back was actually Byakko X stream. Like legit, I think that was one of my favorite fights ever. I mean, tigers are one of my favorite animals, bar none. I freaking think they're incredibly cool. But honestly, just practicing it, doing the fight, looking at my logs, and like building up myself from there was like such a huge thing. And I do feel proud of that. And without the tools, I could never have gone to the level that I'm at now. And I, of course, I'm always striving to improve. Heaven knows I'm not as good as I wish I was. But I wouldn't have gained the confidence in myself in the first place to move forward and then try out harder and harder fights and then go into raid groups and then do Savage and blah 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 if I wasn't able to believe in my own ability to be an asset to the team. Or on the flip side, if we wipe FFLOGS and this tool, it gives me the confidence that I did the best I could and that I did contribute, and that I shouldn't be overly harsh on myself, because sometimes that is one of my easiest default states to go to, where I'm just like bashing myself and I'm just like, this wasn't good enough, that wasn't good enough, this is not okay, maybe you should rethink if you're rating, you're holding everyone back, oh my god, how could you be so selfish? Why don't you let them replace you with someone who could actually do it, you selfish jerk? And that's immediately what I think when I go through these kinds of things. But that is the flip side of the tool. It lets you know and have the confidence that you know what you're doing, and that if you do wipe, to not blame yourself if your numbers are good and you dealt with the mechanics you had to properly. Because by definition, it wouldn't be your fault. And so I think, especially as me with like anxiety, it's like, it really helps me at least. So let's talk cringe. I recently watched a ContraPoints video on cringe, wherein they referenced Melissa Dahl in their theory of cringe in their book called A Theory of Awkwardness. And know what? This ContraPoints video on cringe and the theories of cringe, I do feel, absolutely applies towards FFLOGS and parsing in Final Fantasy XIV. So let's take compassionate cringe versus contemptuous cringe and apply them in the context of parsing in logs. So starting off, compassionate cringe involves feeling empathy and being able to relate towards that person. Like if they're going through an embarrassing or cringeworthy situation, you can relate to that person, regardless if that person is aware of their own levels of cringe or not. And that's going to be important because they don't always know. You feel cringe alongside them for their situation, and you feel the embarrassment that they feel or should feel in that situation. Take the situation of being in a learning party with your raid members, and likewise, some of your raid members are new, and when they are genuinely trying their best, you accidentally wipe just because they messed up a mechanic. In this moment, obviously it is cringy, but on the flip side, they know that they messed up. Knowing me, if I'd probably be spamming sorry into the chat, feeling like a total incomplete jerk, cringing like mad at my own silliness with red markers. I mean, and in the past, I'm gonna just talk about E7S, or E7S? Yes, E7S, sorry, I had to think, cringe. But we had a party where in our raid group, like I forgot to use defensive cooldowns and healers forgot to heal after the ad phase, and meanwhile, the Blasphemy, which was the last ad of that phase, was just spamming this massive high damage AoE. And technically, if I took that clip on its own and put it on YouTube, people might be like, ugh, cringe. But you know what? We didn't know that mechanic was gonna come, and we went into that a bit blind, and so it's just like using compassionate cringe. Yeah, you know what, that sucked, but it's just like we can relate to that. We can identify with that situation and be like, you know what, there have been raid-wide AoEs that we didn't necessarily know about that went to blow up the party. But the main situation in this instance is that it is basically something that we can identify with. It's something that we can relate to, and it makes us all feel a little bit more human in here. Now, contemptuous cringe, on the other hand, involves a massive disconnect between yourself and an individual, where instead of identifying with them, now you either feel annoyance, disgust, or maybe just even like super happy and like a lot of pleasure at their complete demise. It almost feels like a giant karmic win, a satisfying spectacle to just revel in and take in. Often, you're going to see or experience this type of cringe because of these just raw levels of narcissism, the arrogance, or the pure level of Kanye West syndrome that individual is just so morbidly out of sync with reality that it is jarring to say the least. So to see Karma swoop in and just do her work on them feels incredible. Oftentimes, this will be the person that started a priority finder group saying something akin to, "Skip sir or disband because I don't play with scrubs," or "Top DPS only," as they literally have manually entered in only spots for Samurai, Ninja, Black Mage, and Summoner, because they picked literally the top 4 DPS from Ruby Extreme at the 99th percentile on FFLOGS. And yes, I said the 99th percentile on FFLOGS. No names will be said for obvious reasons, but even for myself, I admit I have fallen into this karmic, really pleasurable sensation myself when I have been in and seen a supposed farm party with such strict requirements decline to take me on my ranged DPS when they like demand immediately after of swap, or how to say it, swap to a real DPS. And when I take my summoner and I actually do end up doing the top damage of the party, no, not including raid DPS, I mean just, what is it, a DPS or actual DPS? I'm noticing that the party lead is not only the one making the most mistakes, and so many more mistakes that they are literally killing the other DPS. We're literally on the edge, like the very edge of enrage on the boss that me, the supposed ranged DPS main scrub, that they only let in to get into the fight faster, quite literally carried them. Which is not a point of bragging either. Every time I say that, I need to definitely catch myself. And yes, I am checking my summoner privilege here for sure. But the example I'm thinking of was literally more than a third higher than the next DPS. That big of a gap. And heck, inherently, the statement could even be in itself cringe, but I have never claimed that I'm the best player. I'm not. But you know what? Sometimes I can play a mean summoner. But the core of that and what I was just describing for the cringe wasn't just my performance. Cringe. But it was instead that the individual who flamed me asking, could you bring a real DPS instead of that ranged DPS trash? Is that basically they even foregoed the party buffer, including a so-called inferior range DPS that was actually dramatically underperforming, to say the least. But it's just, even when you're underperforming, it's just the raw level of cockiness, the Kanye West syndrome bursting forth from my monitors, so strong that it's enough to physically knock me back in my chair. Just looking back and remembering the story, it's like a part of me, even as I'm reading this and like freaking telling you the story, it's like I'm indulging in this horrific failure. And it gives me a sense that, hey, that guy deserves this as some sort of retribution from the heavens. Also known as me on my astrologian. Because he was such a genuine jerk. Which, for the record, would I feel guilt otherwise for indulging? 100%. I'd like to think that I'd have some heart if it was just genuine accident, of course. But why exactly did this person say that ranged DPS is garbage and to take a real DPS? Well, the answer to that question is going to be using the exact calculations on raid DPS that, statistically speaking, range DPS are significantly below other DPS. This isn't even getting into the fact that some raid leaders literally don't even look at raid DPS, but they look at actual DPS, which for dancers is devastating. For bards, it's devastating, and so that discussion isn't even worth having in this video though. But let's look at Cinderdrift Extreme on the 99th percentile. Because why would someone with that mentality ever look at anything less? Oh. Summoner is at about 18,000.6, and then the vastly inferior Machinist, Dancer, and Bard are down around 17.2 thousand. Or actually, if we look at Bard, it's all the way down at 16.3. Oh my god, could you imagine explaining to like a raid lead, like, oh, you're 900 DPS lower? My god, these people would freak. Maybe that's why they're freaking, I don't know. But anyhow, that means that gap, if you're a bard, between like a summoner and a bard, you are dealing about 2.3 thousand less DPS than the great and almighty summoner. Oh, how loath art thou, lugubrious lamentations of the desolate frigid winter, and melancholy is life whence one be a bard. But in other words, I experienced a great deal of contemptuous cringe when I experienced that, and even when recalling the story. I honestly recalled this with a bit of a sense of joy, in case my silliness didn't indicate that. But someone who acted poorly and made claims to be amazing, in fact, was killing our DPS literally, repeatedly, with red markers and other mechanics that they were messing up. Ugh, cringe. But in summary, to cite, it is that compassionate cringe is an emotional identification with that person, whereas contemptuous cringe is an emotional distancing. And you know what? When it comes to parsing numbers and FFLOGS, these are absolutely in there, both contemptuous and compassionate cringe. Because if you're feeling compassion for a raid member whose DPS numbers might be a little low, it's just like you want to help them, you want to bolster them up. Whereas if it's contemptuous cringe, you're just like, haha, that raid lead that wanted the perfect thing, haha, they're literally at like the 99, the first percentile. Whoops, I cringe. I just mixed up my numbers. They're at the first percentile. So it's just like, you do get a little bit of that. But you know what? Something stood out there in that last little bit here for me, that last point. That my role as a ranged DPS that I wanted to take into this fight was deemed unworthy, unfit, less than. Something to be easily discarded if at all possible. Oh, I would much rather a summoner. And so let's talk about roles. For Final Fantasy XIV, there are a lot of reasons to take the other roles, ranging from party-wide buffs for the roles like ranged DPS to raid-wide AoE damage reduction, and then the ability to handle ranged mechanics better than the melee DPS. But that is a discussion much better left for another video. The main point that a lot of individuals make against ranged DPS is like the screenshot from the FFLOGS I showed earlier. To be lower than the other DPS regardless of any context is a bad choice. Do you bring extra utility outside of DPS, including handling mechanics better? Meh, who cares? Your DPS is lower, dude. No one cares. But in fact, recently I have actually seen discussions debating and simulating the math at length of what would happen if you replace the ranged DPS role in your group completely. And yes, you heard that right. No bard, no machinist, and no dancer in your group. Their damage has been deemed too low, and now they are cancelled harder than James Charles in 2019. Like, let's be genuine and take an in-depth look at the maximum value of the highest DPS in the fight. The difference would be the summoner, the absolute maximum apex of DPS we have right now, and the bard, the absolute worst. So that would be about 19.7k minus 17.2k. And that roughly rounds to being about 2.5 thousand DPS difference. To a raid leader who is currently struggling to pass a DPS check like Eden 6 Savage or Shiva, let alone the ultimate fights, they're much harder. This will translate in their mind to 25,000 DPS loss over 10 seconds. Or 2.5, we're just going to do it in thousands, over 60 seconds, would be in their mind a loss of 150,000 DPS. Let one not forget that the many fights can be around 10 minutes long depending on the fight and the mechanics. And that, if we just looked at the numbers raw like that, not including phase transitions or whatever, that would be, for 10 minutes, whopping 1,500,000 DPS loss, just because instead of Summoner, you took a Bard in this instance. That, to the number focused raid lead, might be the amount that keeps them up at night. And you might think I'm joking, I'm not joking. If you're wiping at 0.5%, that might be the actual difference between a clear or not, genuinely. And if that group was trying to clear the Ultimate Coil of Bahamut Ultimate Raid for months, that might actually be soul crushing. And I'm not saying that with any air of joke, I'm being super serious right now. So I'm not going to pretend that I can't empathize, because I totally can. That is super demoralizing, super upsetting, and it really sucks for the entire group. But the problem with this is that most groups aren't in this predicament, where they need to make the micro optimizations for each and every single last aspect of their group and how they approach the raid. You don't. Usually you don't. Yet many people still carry this mentality forward and are actively barring particular jobs from joining, even if it's a fight with a mathematically very, very low DPS in rage check like Cinder Drift Extreme. This leads to players who should never, ever be concerned with such an aspect all of a sudden being intensely fixated upon it. And here I'm actually going to coin the term damaged focused gaze. I'm probably going to change this to something a little less wordy later, but that's what I'm calling it for now. But the point is, in spite of all of the evidence provided to some individuals or scenarios or trials, that these people intensely insist and fixate if their team isn't comprised in a very particular way, and they are convinced that if it is in this very particular situation and configuration, that's going to end in disastrous failure. And they might mean it in earnest. After all, I did say just a few points ago that people come to this game of their own volition in their free time and that they're paying for it. So why wouldn't they want to emulate the best of the best? Is that not their right? Should they not be able to? And surely that is a point that is worth talking about more in depth on its own. But as for our discussion on FFLOGS here, this is a case where context means everything. In the absolute bleeding edge raid groups that are just barely away from attaining their goal, I can absolutely see the merit in wanting to change things up a bit from a job perspective. And if you're on the bleeding edge, yeah, you should be willing to make that choice if that's the kind of group you're with. But if I'm being super honest, outside of Ultimate Raids, I do not see the value of this. I don't. And that might sound super condescending, but it's not meant to be. But as someone who doesn't take the absolute optimal jobs into raids, it just is not necessary to worry about this micro-optimization. Usually, outside of ultimate tier content, the reasons DPS is too low to make a cutoff is either because someone killed a DPS with a marker, a DPS ran off the edge, they might have backflipped off the edge actually, they might not be as confident with their opener or rotation, or they might just simply have forgotten to use consumables like foods and potions. Or let's be honest, most people probably will not be clearing the entire Savage tier week 1. Or for a lot of these bleeding edge groups, they're trying for literally day 1, like under 24 hours, which is crazy to me, but they're doing it. But that means, though, that we also need to account for the quality of the gear of the player when we look at this particular issue, if we're being super honest. Context is everything here. If you're 0.5% away from clearing Ifrit and Garuda Savage in week 1, when you enter week 2 and can buy more gear from Tomestones and more drops from E5S Ramu, you're going to enter that fight one heck of a lot stronger than before. And now, maybe suddenly you are okay with that Bard. And as someone who has literally just cleared this last week E5S and E6S on my Bard, yeah, it's not the job, that is preventing the DPS check on this particular content. I've literally done it on Bard, and mathematically it is the worst. But in summary, the problem is taking the extremely niche problem and then expanding it to where you don't see someone screaming at the Bard in their, or where you actually do see someone, where you do see someone screaming in the expert run at the Bard for being a Bard and not a black mage. And that is the threshold where it does become totally unfair and it does become unreasonable. So perhaps the one major exception to the so-called damage-focused gaze, I really need to coin a better term, is that unlike the other DPS, the Red Mage, with its unique ability to cast multiple revives in extremely rapid succession, is superb utility without parallel. The ultimate utility, in my opinion, is revive. But I would be remiss to say it was as simple as that, though. In fact, the Summoner with its single swift cast revived is still considered widely to be more preferable replacement to the still lowly Red Mage. And I have seen this debate across many discords, forums, and like, even after the most recent past few months when the Red Mage got a very significant DPS buff. Lo and behold, the Red Mage that is still 500 less DPS than Summoner. Ugh. The damage-focused gaze is real. But as that last point raised, this goes much farther than just role. This goes even into the individual job in that role. Like, would you rather have a machinist or a bard or a dancer? If you're gonna pick the evils, given the numbers and how players' attitudes are towards the bard and the dancer, the machinist is begrudgingly the best of the worst, the lesser of the three evils, as some have put it. Thank you for me reading that. I'm only playing machinist this tier. Or how about Red Mage versus Summoner versus Black Mage? That's another one. Or what about Monk versus Ninja versus Dragoon versus Samurai? In any of these scenarios, there is a lot of pushback for playing what people deem from FFLOGS numbers as the wrong class. Samurai might be one of the best examples of that, actually. Samurai was the, backside of the joke for the longest time, having many memes and jokes and jabs made at it. In fact, one of them was like a JoJo meme where like the monk was just wrecking the samurai, and I was like, oh my gosh. But anyhow, the point is that there were so many memes and stuff that it was just horrible to take a samurai to the group. Until recently when their FFLOGS numbers spiked up. Or Monk, that's another good one. Through prior expansions, I remember there was a group called Delete Monk, and no, I'm not joking, that was literally a thing. But I want to even look at choosing a class. Like, let's take a look from the new player's perspective. As someone that does play many MMORPGs, I like to know what class, job, or role, or whatever particular specialization is called before I make a character. For World of Warcraft, they have a lot of similar parsing tools for rating, some that are even more in-depth than what we have. So when I look at what I want to do and my role in terms of a class and specialization for World of Warcraft, well, I do admit that I do defer to the experts in that community and their top picks. Will I ever need to be worried or like super worried about using an AoE purge from a Blood Elf versus an AoE stomp from a Tauren? Or what about the passive heal from being a Zandalari troll with that particular Akunda specialization versus not having any of that as a Vulpira? Will I ever need to worry about all that? Probably not. I will probably never really realize the full difference impact. Or let's take the example of what about Holy Priest versus Resto Shaman? Will I ever really genuinely honestly need to like play them? Or actually, if I'm going off of what a lot of experts say, I should be throwing both in the dumpster. If you go off the current recommendations from experts, that if I was to invest myself back into World of Warcraft right now, then I'd be aiming for a Blood Elf Holy Paladin at the recommendation of the experts. So yeah, even newer players are undeniably impacted by this damage-focused gaze that focuses purely on the numbers, at the absolute detriment of everything else. Like, take for example, racial choices for World of Warcraft, your complete character aesthetics. Basically, if you want to be like a giant werewolf worgen or a cute Vulpira, Well, too bad. You better be a blood elf or get out of here, scrub. So I actually want to end this discussion with the idea of goals. Because ultimately, I think goals are a great way to frame parsing in general. Whenever we're talking about goals in an environment with multiple people, we need to break it down into multiple sections. Firstly, what are the goals of that individual themselves? Secondly, what are the goals of the group? Now this may come as a radical surprise to some. Probably not, but oh well. But sometimes the goal of an individual of a group may not align with the goals of the group. Ooh. Or sometimes, if you have a few goals that align for that particular individual, but you might have some goals that bifurcate into their very own sections of goals. In fact, if I'm being super honest, sometimes the goals of the group as a whole might not even truly align with the individual goals of any of the members. And yes, that is actually a thing before anyone says it's not. Oftentimes, this is propagated because of a lack of communication between members where all people are assuming everyone wants the same thing and no one's speaking up about it. It's just like, oh, we need to clear this in the first month. And meanwhile, everyone's just like, oh my god, I don't know if I have the time to clear this in the first month, including the leader. But the leader's just like, I think that everyone else in the group wants this. And then everyone else is in the group is just like, I think everyone else wants this. Meanwhile, no one wants it. Everyone's fine if it takes like month 2 or month 3 to clear this ultimate fight. But let's reel it back. When the group is composed of individuals that all want the same goal, there's happiness, there's bliss, there's group cohesion. And this group mobilizes as a single solid unit to tackle whatever they choose to tackle. But when you have a group that is fractured between its members, it has a fundamental divide that may sometimes need to bridge the gap and ignore, or make a major compromise between members. Likewise, that can lead up to very serious built-up feelings of resentment, a video topic all of its own that I'm daring to even open this Pandora's box only the tiniest crack here. Resentment in the context of parsing and FFLOGS is when an individual's performance or desire to improve doesn't match what the goals of that group are. Or, in other words, you have Jason over there who is on his Black Mage playing Freeze Mage because giant Jaina from World of Warcraft is the ultimate love of his life and he wants to be her. Meanwhile, the rest of the group over here wailing on Shiva, just begging for a clear, going, Jason, please, use Fire Form, Jason, please. But I think that the biggest friction here ultimately comes from a lack of people acting in the manner that would benefit their own goals the most. And yes, I am looking at it from the selfish perspective. I know that there are definitely some like people who are like big on psych and stuff in my audience, so I understand that we're looking at it from the selfish perspective. So I'm looking at it from the individual perspective. Let's take an individual that wants to join an extremely hardcore world first clear guild with multiple raid teams. They want that clear and they want it so intensely bad. Like our last ultimate tier, oh boy, that was intense. But that is an admirable goal, right? I want to join one of those groups, right? That's an admirable goal. But here's the problem. This player that wants to join these groups is Jason. Yes, the same Jason from before. He only plays Black Mage, he isn't willing to swap, and he only uses ice abilities, because Jaina is exactly who he wants to be. He has Jaina posters all over his room, Jaina's necklace around his neck, and he even has a Jaina pet. Oh, but this isn't going to match with this raid group here. This is going to be a huge disparity. What Jason wants differs greatly from what a world first clearing group would want. That means that the group wants maximum DPS and to push on the very first day, probably trying for like 12 plus hours at least, and just making sure that that very first week is when they get the clear. Whether they do or don't, they're going to try their darn best. And before they have sometimes even fully capped their tombstones for some groups, to push through that fight as insanely fast as humanly possible. But if you aren't using your fire skills for the record on a Black Mage, you're losing out on a huge amount of DPS. I'm not talking insignificant, I'm talking huge. Because that's like the real meat and potatoes of the rotation. And this is going to cause friction, and that's going to cause frustration. Guaranteed. But here, I'm talking about a more classic case, because I think everyone could easily have come up with that on their own. But let's talk about the other case that is just as dangerous, if not more so at times. And so let's take the hardcore raiding individual who is wanting to join a super casual raid group. You probably know where I'm going with this one. This person practices at the training dummy for a full hour before raid, period. They book it. In fact, if they are using Google Calendar, they put that stuff right in front of it. That full hour blocked off. Don't call me Patricia. Don't text me Nathan. I am training. And if they aren't parsing at the 85th or above percentile, then they are extremely upset. This person has now just applied and joined a casual raiding group that is a bunch of parents all working full-time and raising kids. And so they have only scheduled a humble 2 hours per week, which is very common for the record. Just talking to a bunch of different raiders, just like 2 hours per week, that is actually definitely a thing. But these people don't practice their rotations before raid and are probably a little rusty and burned out from childcare and work by the time they get to it. But regardless, they enjoy the savage raiding and they want to conquer it. It might take a few months, but who cares? And that's going to be their mantra and attitude. Long as they're having fun, that's the main thing. Gear will eventually even change from best in slot from this month to a few months from now. So it's just like, they're just like, what's the pressure? Why do I need absolute best in slot? Nah. Now this individual that applied for this group, based on how they act, can completely determine like what's gonna go on with the group. Either they may leave, which in my opinion would be the fair and most mature decision for themselves and the group. I'm getting ready to say this one. Or this person, and I have experienced this in the past, might actually literally lash out at the group, denigrate them, say how lazy they are, and how they don't take anything seriously, how awful they all are, how they all should feel bad, how if they don't pick a real DPS class, that they aren't going to clear E6S because of the DPS check. And I should say, disclaimer, this was a very long time ago, years ago, but I am using modern E6S as an example. And it's just, this person would probably in that case, honestly, demoralize the group. In fact, they did demoralize the entire group. They did upset the entire group. And I remember hearing lazy, unkept, apathetic, aloof, uncaring, and selfish. Ooh, you're so selfish for working a full-time job and then having to take your kids back and forth from daycare. Oh, what do you mean that your kid got sick? Darn it, you better make it. But anyhow, it was just heartbreaking to see like some of the people who were there who were like parents who genuinely could not raid more. It wasn't a lazy thing. And this is another perfect example of how the goals of the individual do not match up with the goals of the group. But that's, as everyone probably guessed, not completely true. Because these parents still desire to clear the content. That is still their goal. These people still want to clear Shiva Savage. They want that Ramu mount. Heck, they might love that mount and want to mount Ramu all day, every day for years to come. But the difference is how they want to obtain that goal in this instance. So it's almost less the goal in this instance and more like the means to the end of trying to get that goal, if that makes sense. It's just because the parents are prioritizing their children and jobs and they can't sit down and practice the rotation on a training dummy for an hour. That doesn't mean that they don't care though. And that is going to be where I now start to go and wrap up this video. Is FFLOGS and parsing bad? Hell no, I love the tool. I'll say that on record, I love the tool. I think that it is a marvelous tool, and it truly makes such a big difference to me as a player and as someone who always wants to improve. And as someone with pretty bad anxiety who doesn't like to perform bad and ruin everyone else's. I digress. But am I the most hardcore raider? No, I'm not. But that doesn't mean that I can't enjoy the tools at my disposal and want to use them to always strive to get better. Like when I started first playing Summoner and Machinist, oh my gosh, I was bad. I was really bad. I will just say that outright, horrific. But through practice and getting so much steady feedback through the tool, I honed in my skill and have gotten so much better. And I feel proud of that. And without the tools, I could never have gone to the level that I have. I wouldn't have gained even the confidence to move forward and to have tried the harder fights after Byakko X when I came back. I mean, whole long story, but it'll be a different video. But the point is that I had to believe in myself first and foremost, of my ability to be an asset to the team. Or on the flip side, if we wipe FFLOGS and this tool gives me like the confidence that I did my best and could, and that I did contribute, and that I shouldn't be overly harsh on myself, because that's really easy for me. And that is honestly the flip side of the tool, is it lets you know how you're doing, and that if you wipe, to not blame yourself if your numbers aren't good. Or I mean, if they are good. I mean, even if they aren't good, as long as you're doing mechanics, most of the content of the game really doesn't need that much DPS, honestly. But I want to say that might sound like a cop-out, but that is my truth. There are many times where if I didn't know and if I didn't have proof, then I honestly may have just given up. There is no denying that parsing helps groups clear content. In fact, I am absolutely of the mind that parsing in FFLOGS and statistical analysis is mandatory for higher level rating. I would absolutely say mandatory. In a theoretical world, could you clear ultimate fights without it? Probably. I'd say probably. Like, these people are really good who are clearing it in the first place. Probably. But reality is that these tools help people engage and understand the content so much better at such a level of depth that it's not possible. Like, the level of depth is not possible without these tools. The analysis and fundamental grasp on what is actually happening is absolutely unmatched. And so I find these tools, and my ultimate opinion on them is that they are marvelous, they are helpful, and they are mandatory for people like me who really like growth and always moving forward. Parsing helps me always know that I'm improving. But the dark side is when you have people who weaponize numbers and parsing as a tool to berate, harass, and discriminate against others. And I've seen it more times than I dare try and recall in party finder groups. Heck, let's even be honest, party finder listings, without even going into the group, raid groups, forum posts, Reddit posts, and like, it's just... Some people take the numbers and parse this as gospel and wail on others with them with impunity. In fact, I dare to ask the question of just how many people would be top tier raiders if it was not for the toxicity and cruelty that some small subset of players exude. And when I say small though, I should say, I do mean small. I feel the need to stress that almost every single time I bring this up, the community as a whole, I do feel rejects this toxicity and embraces players as long as they try. And that does eventually get into questions like, do the goals of that individual match the goals of the group? Where if the goals of the individual don't match the goals of the group, there will be friction. Or where the means to an end of what the people's goals are don't match of how much people can do. If there's a disconnect there, that will cause friction in and of itself. But another issue is where people take FFLOGS and parses to be the be-all end-all, where if you aren't playing a top parsing job like Summoner or Black Mage, then what are you even doing here? And I've absolutely heard that. This mentality, though, is valuable for the absolute apex of bleeding edge raiding. Yes, even in FFXIV. But for people who aren't looking at first day clears of all Savage raiding or trying to be in a world first clear of Ultimate Coil of Bahamut, it's just not realistic. It's genuinely an actually unfair standard to apply to other people, especially if you're doing things in like leveling dungeons. Then yeah, I have literally even myself been berated during a leveling dungeon when I was super tired on my monk. I got that Amaro mount way too fast. That was some long nights, but even I've gone even in a leveling dungeon, it's like, what? We're not even max level, dude, what? But it happens. Or like, probably more commons than an expert, and it's like, bruh, it's an expert, come on. It's just bleh. But this mentality is very useful for bleeding edge raiding, and I do say, if that's your goal and people subscribe to that goal, And absolutely, that's a fair standard. I mean, if they ask to be a part of that group, well, that's how that group do. But I should say that as someone who has cleared E5S and E6S on the Bard, it's not even mandatory for people on the bleeding edge, because E5S and E6S isn't bleeding edge content. I'm not deluding myself. But like, it's not mandatory at all. Yet you can bet that I've seen groups only have a posting for Machinist on their party finder because of that E6S DPS check, and I have actually seen it where they actually don't have any ranged DPS. Like literally, it's like three melee DPS and like a summoner or a black mage. I don't even know. I haven't actually checked the sims. Is that better? I don't know, but I digress. But I guess that kind of wraps up this discussion and kind of my full thoughts on it. I know it's long, but I also feel that this topic is one of the few topics that really deserves this level of attention and thoughtfulness towards it. I think that there are a few very big topics and underlying concerns that, you know what, this is one of them, and I definitely don't regret it. I do see the length of this recording, and I think that this topic deserves it, because it has been such a big point of pain and such a controversial topic, because you know what, you have people on both sides of the fence, and you know what, I'm not going to say either of them is wrong. Depending on the context, both are right. Depending on the context, both are wrong. And then even in some contexts, both are concurrently right and wrong. It's one of those things where it's just like rightness and wrongness is not a Boolean. It's more of a spectrum of just answers. So anyhow, as always, any likes, comments, and subscribes are incredibly appreciated and go such an extremely long way to helping me. Honestly, they are super appreciated. I cannot say how much the support really means to me. But as always, I am just one dude with their own thoughts and opinions on this, and I am genuinely curious to hear what everyone else thinks on this, because this is such a big topic in this game, and one that even developers have spoken on a little bit. So if you'd leave your thoughts, experiences, or feelings down in the comment section below, I actually genuinely look extremely forward to seeing what everyone thinks. Heck, I know that I'm gonna get a lot of comment of cringed, but sadly that comes with the territory. I stepped here, oh well. Anyhow, that is all for this one. I hope to see you on the next video. Cheers, and I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cringe.